It's always a pleasure having you over Talking Points on your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome. Over the years, there has been a need for the education on the African continent to be reimagined, especially as African education systems are at a critical point in their evolution. With Africa having the youngest population in the world, expected to be home to over 1 billion young people by the year 2050, it would be of huge benefit for the African continent and the world to invest in its education systems to change the continent or for change to prevail. In present-day Africa, education stands at a crossroads confronting the challenges related to the juxtaposition of existing deficits with rapidly evolving demands of the digital age. This sparked the work across several African countries to turn the tide. The number of out-of-school children across the continent remains stubbornly high. In addition, with the rapid advancements of the 21st century's technologies presenting new challenges such as increasing necessity for digital fluency, African education systems must adapt swiftly to remain relevant and, of course, competitive. With the change in dynamics, no wonder the African Union, during this year's summit, set forth an ambitious and noble theme, the Year of Education, Educate an African Fit for the 21st Century. How can we ensure that these young people have access to quality as well as inclusive education and skills training to prepare them for the future in terms of social, economic and politics? Join us as we debut today's conversation on Talking Points, where we shall be evoking today's topic of discussion that centers on education for change, asking the question, what is at stake? Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for always honoring and trusting your Pan-African channel, For You Media Africa. You're watching on For You Television, listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3. Meanwhile, we're streaming live on YouTube. Meanwhile, to debut today's conversation, which centers on education for change in the African continent and beyond. Joining us this day in Cameroon is Mr. NCHENDEH Christian, who is an educationist. Good day to you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good day, madam, and good day to televiewers. We wish you all a wonderful start of the week, and we pray that our discussion today will impact life and transform Africa.
It's all about the transformation of the African continent. Meanwhile, still in Cameroon here, we shall be, of course, having the contribution of Dr. NGWANYAM, who is an entrepreneur and, of course, an economist. He's here in Cameroon. Taking you out of the African continent, we've been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is a Pan-Africanist and doubles as an economist. Meanwhile, you are the CEO of Christian Fintech. Greetings to you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for inviting me. I hope we have a fruitful conversation today, and thank our televiewers for tuning in as well.
Thank you immensely for honoring our invitation. Of course, we look forward to a fruitful conversation in a bid to transform or bring about a change of narrative on the African continent. In a bid to debut today's conversation, we kickstart with you, Dr. NGWANYAM. Now, in a bid to comprehend the current state of the education system on the African continent, just to reiterate, over the weekend, we saw the Egyptian Minister of Education that said there was a need for Africa and, of course, its own nation to revamp the education system. So in a bid to comprehend this, what can we say is the state of education on the African continent, Dr. NGWANYAM?
Education is one of those things that we really need from the time we are born to the time we die. That is, we keep on training ourselves, we keep on learning, and we keep on picking on new information and skills. It's very important to have the right information and skills, otherwise we will not interact with our environment effectively. So it's about, having what it takes to interact beautifully and effectively with the environment so we can get the best out of that environment. So if you don't have what it takes, then of course you will mess up big time, and you realize that you pass through this world be creating more problems than bringing solutions. The world is full of problems, and what we are called upon to do is to solve those problems. Happiness, wealth creation, and and whatever you want lies in your ability to solve problems. If you are looking for a place where there are no problems, it does not exist. That would be in the grave. And therefore, if you want to succeed in this world, then you must develop the capacity to solve problems. And there is no way you're going to develop the capacity to solve problems if you don't have the right education. And that's where Africa and Cameroon have messed up big time. And so for the last 60, 70 years, we've not had the right education, and that's why we are suffering so much. And I think it's about time we get it right and correct it. Otherwise, we would pay a very huge price. We're already paying a huge price. But the bottom line is, if we don't realize that we made a mistake and try to get it right, the Chinese and others will come and enslave us again, and it's going to be horrible.
Exactly, Dr. Nick. Now to proceed with you, NCHENDEH Christian, given you're equally a pedagogic, now in your opinion, as one who is in the field, what would you say is the state or current affairs as well as far as education in Africa is concerned?
Well, thank you, madam. We need to note that education generally is a passport to the future. Without education, you cannot visualize the future. And Africa as a whole, for the past century or the past decade, we have been trying so hard to see how we can amend the system of education. I think at the level of the Ministry of Secondary Education, Professor Nalova, she has implemented a new pedagogic approach, which is pedagogy by competence, the competence-based approach. So a lot has been done, but a lot still needs to be done, because education is a constant process where the change needs to, an evolution, change and innovation in the methods, innovation in the approach of transforming or dishing out knowledge is supposed to be adapting constantly. You come to see I think the new system now, we are mostly trying to drill our students mostly on e-learning. And if you observe the Ministry of Secondary Education in Cameroon presently has a YouTube channel with a lot of lessons. This is one of the ways that the ministry is trying to put in place. The government of Cameroon is trying to put in place to make sure that even if you are in a bush, so far as there's little access of internet, you can have access to materials which are from qualified pedagogues. So that's one of the approaches I think the Cameroon government is trying to do to improve on the inclusiveness and the access to education. Unfortunately, Cameroon is a country in Africa, and Africa as a whole has a problem of digital divide, which means that Africa is still far behind in terms of internet. Notwithstanding the problem at hand, which is the access to internet, we cannot be sleeping without carrying out some innovations, and that's what the Ministry of Secondary Education is doing, which is something that the Ministry of Higher Education has been doing for a long time. We have to just upload what the Minister of Secondary Education is doing. Unfortunately, basic education, we have not yet integrated the system of e-learning with the lessons that are done through the internet. So I think when it comes to education in Africa, we are backward, but the government of Cameroon is trying everything possible to innovate and to adapt the teaching process, the learning process with the innovation. One of the major innovations that came up in 2020 for the GCE system was the implementation of internship, which is something we need to really applaud the minister for, where students now in Form 4 or those in Form 5, those in upper 6 too, they have to go for internship in secondary school. In those days, internship were things that we could only talk about internship when we were in the university. So those are the things that I think the minister, Professor Nalova, is doing endlessly to improve access to education, access to quality education. With this, the concept of clean school. So as we'll be going ahead in the topic of discussion, we'll be unveiling other things and then seeing future perspectives that the government can implement to better off what they are actually doing presently. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Christian. Now, Nabi, to proceed with you, Dr. FONGOD, given you are Pan-Africanist as well, you've listened to your co-panelists, but then since we're discussing education for change on the African continent, what is your perspective of the current state of affairs in Africa with regards to education? And of course, how can we bring about education to a point where it can bring about this change which we are talking about in Africa?
I think we have to, first of all, basically pivot back to the origin of education itself so that we can be able to build a roadmap that is meaningful as we basically go along, putting every single thing is that we need our resources together to build a more robust society, using education as a vehicle. If you look at the prehistoric time, this is when man was just about emerging out of the caves. Even while they were still in the caves, knowledge primarily was transmitted through storytelling, imitation and oral traditions. These are fundamentally very important when you start talking about education, because we just heard the young man talking about the issues of internship, which is basically a form of imitation, which is vital, especially in skill training. So when we start talking about education, we need to be able to pivot back a little. As a Pan-African and someone who is very interested in understanding Africa's historic past, we need to be able to give kudos, as a matter of fact, great credit to civilizations like those of Egypt, because they literally gave to us, the basis of most of the templates we have today in terms of our own philosophical thought, and which basically also influenced Greek philosophy, which is the basis for Western philosophy, of which most of us are enjoying today in terms of our own educational process. So far as I'm concerned, I think that we really must be able to understand that religion, which I am kind of a little bit scared to introduce at this point, but religion has played a vital role in terms of humanity's education. You cannot talk about ancient civilizations without talking about the role that religion has played, especially in bringing us up to speed where we are today. In religion, it's where we had philosophy. In religion, we had science. The whole entire premise of science and education or philosophy, diverged around the 16th century, but the 14th, 16th century actually. But the reality is that religion and philosophy, or science and philosophy, was the same thing vis-a-vis religion as well. So religion, philosophy, and science was just one discipline. The idea why I'm saying this is because we live on this in a society where we are primarily driven by religion, either be Islam, either be it Christianity. A huge population of the African continent, it's actually Islamic, a huge percentage is Christians. So we have to be able to find ways in which we can go back to the original template. If you look at the first universities we have on the continent of Africa, one was in Morocco, one was in Egypt, and all of these two universities were Islamic centers. If you look between the 7th century and the 14th century, this was at the peak of the civilization that was taking place around Mali, especially in Timbuktu, being spurred by the great Mansa Musa with the great university called Sankore University. These were all Islamic centers that were very instrumental in pushing the issues of mathematics, the issues of medicine, and science in general. So we have to be able to make sure that we fully integrate these different sectors sectors as we go along in trying to be able to change whatever we need to change and bringing, Africa up to speed so that we can have the right form of education to compete, within the 21st century with the rest of the world. If you are interested in understanding what's happening outside of the continent, you'll realize that we have basically moved to a place where science is leading, the STEMs, courses are basically leading, and we need to be able to incorporate that a lot within the restructuring that we're having on the African continent. I think we have to use technology, which is something I'm quite versed with. We have to use technology to be able to do so. I am basically stating here that the notion that some young kid is living in some remote part of the continent of Africa and does not have access to internet, it's crazy, especially when we are talking about the fact that we have footprints of satellite dishes of satellite their footprints on the African continent that has tremendous reach, which means there's no reason why some kids somewhere should not be able to have access to internet. So we need to be able to start building little tiny centers that will be able to capture satellite transmissions, which is basically internet based, so that we can be able to now set up Wi-Fi or hotspots in these small communities to be able to allow young African children to have access to e-learning platforms that they can be able to help themselves, because the reality is, with the complexity that we're having, especially with AI, there are no classrooms that can be able to literally prepare you, for this market. We need to be able to have young people who go online, and instead of playing games and being on social media, they can actually be able to get, the education they need by learning coding, which is absolutely quite easy to do if you just have a computer. So we need to be able to make sure that the young African is endowed with all of these resources. Otherwise, things will be a little bit difficult for us going forward. But I'm quite optimistic that with the right approach and with some of the changes I see happening on the African continent, we are basically moving the needle forward. I think that we are pivoting in the right direction, and True North looks absolutely beautiful from my vantage point.
Exactly, like we should cite countries like Kenya, like Rwanda, that they are actually taking advantage of technology as far as education is concerned. And now, I'll get into you, NCHENDEH Christian. Listen to your co-panelist. Do you share the same opinion as him in terms of how education could bring about change?
Yes, I align 100% with all what he indicated, especially at the level of AI. AI is taking over education. AI is taking over the world. So the earlier African curriculum adapts and incorporates some elements of AI.
Okay, well, we're hoping on Christian to get back to us. With you, Dr. Nick, in a bit to comprehend, you listen to your co-panelists. How can, or are you convinced as a pedagogic expert that education indeed on the African continent, in a similar line as your co-panelists, can bring about change which the African need, and of course the transformation which Africa is moving towards?
If one were to ask you to quickly summarize the problems of Africa, you could summarize them in 2 words, and I call them I squared. The first thing is ignorance, and the second one is irresponsibility. So when you are ignorant, means you don't know what is right, what to do, on how to do things. That's already a problem. Then, even when you seem to know what is right and then you don't do it, that is irresponsibility. And we seem to have our fair share of these 2 things: ignorance and irresponsibility. So yes, we can cure the ignorance by putting in place a good educational system that shows us the principles and what we need to do to survive in life. And then at the same time, the irresponsibility, we have to cure the irresponsibility to character training. Our characters, we need to make sure that we train people in a way that they're well behaved. And then when you listen to His Eminence Christian Cardinal Tumi, he laid out 6 principles that we all need to follow to be able to succeed in whatever we are doing in life. Number 1, that we should. If you look at education the world over, you probably could divide that into 3 or 4 classes. The best kind of education is found in countries like Finland, Japan, Germany. When I say Finland, I mean actually all those Scandinavian countries. Then you come to you have Germany, you have Holland, and then you skip France, you skip Britain, you skip America. Then you go to Japan, you have South Korea, you have Singapore and Malaysia. The United States and the UK, France, they're in their own class, and you call that class B, because the you know, in as much as they are very good at technology, when it comes to emotional intelligence and how they behave as a community, they still have problems. And then in France, there's also another problem. Let me not say it here. But so they are class B. Then in class C, you'll be looking at countries like China, India, Morocco, Algeria. And then in class D is countries like Cameroon and the rest of the third world. We are not, those of us in class D, we are not doing very well at all, and we need to catch up with the rest of the world. If France and America are being threatened by the other countries through the education, then you know that it's important for us to do something about our education. And America was threatened by Russia many years ago, before they started this this space explorations, and Russia seemed to be gaining grounds over America. So America had to go in there and change her education and insist on STEM: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So that's the core of things: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And then to that, let's add another E: economics and entrepreneurship. Then we add some soft skills like leadership, computer knowledge, and management skills, financial intelligence, and what have you, agriculture. So, but when you look at what others are doing, and then you look at what we are doing in Africa, what we have been doing in Africa for the last 60 years, you realize that they came and gave us a kind of an education where we just memorize some stuff and recite history, recite geography, and recite all sorts of things, and get degrees and the biggest certificates, but with no capacity to do anything. So if someone were to ask you what exactly is wrong with our education, it's an education that has no capacity. It lacks the capacity to change water into wine. It lacks the capacity to get things done.
Exactly. And now moving forward, since we're discussing how we can bring about education on the African continent to push for this change which Africa is championing for. Now with you, NCHENDEH Christian, given we had to stop with you due to some connection issues, but then it's good to have you back. And now when we look at the stakeholders involved, earlier on you mentioned the Ministry of Education at the, say, Ministry of Higher Education, as basic education, and a host of others on the African continent, especially in Cameroon. Now, when you look at these various stakeholders that are involved when education is concerned, do you think, or how can this different stakeholders get involved in a bid for them to champion or say get to a point where they can serve education to the young people of the African continent in a bid for it to result in change?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was a little bit interrupted with the network here. Before I answer to your question, I will a little bit throw light on what Dr. Nick said, entrepreneurship.
Yes.
One of the innovations that Professor Nalova came up with when she took over the ministry is introduction of entrepreneurship as a subject at the O level and A level. So entrepreneurship since 2020 is now taught in secondary schools, which is something we really need to appreciate, because some of us, we saw entrepreneurship at the bachelor level, for those of us who went through technical education. Some are seeing it at the master's level. So now the future of our children as they're coming up, they'll start seeing entrepreneurship as a course, as a subject in Form 3 henceforth. But unfortunately, it's applicable only for technical vocational training. That's those who are doing commercial and those who are doing industrial. Our cry could be that why not extend it to those who are doing arts and sciences, that's the general education, because what we do, anything we study, we hope to one day become entrepreneurs. So creating a subject like entrepreneurship at the level of secondary schools is initiating the students to be capable of engaging in initiative that can have some returns in terms of investment.
Absolutely.
Which is something very important. At the level of the basic education, they're doing now something called agriculture. They're doing basic agriculture there, which is also good. So far, when it comes to our system in Africa, particularly that of Cameroon, we can look at outreach. The Minister of Secondary Education trying to increase the outreach, that's the access to education by the e-learning, as I indicated before, with more than 5,000 video lessons presently available on YouTube for free. Lessons that were designed by experts and supervised by inspectors, national inspectors. Method of teaching presently in Cameroon is the competence-based approach, which is one of the best pedagogic approach in transferring knowledge. Secondly, exposure, as I indicated before, the students now for the technical education, that's commercial and industrial, they are now exposed to internship, which was not done before 2015 or 2020. Internship was not part of that program. They were not seeing the realities in the field. They were just doing the practicals and ending at that level. Evaluation too. This year, we really need to give a hand of applause to the minister, because this year, and to the GC board, this year the GC board implemented one of the modern tools of evaluation, which is the camera, the CCTV. In all of the writing centers, all of the GC accommodation centers in Cameroon, cameras were used as an element to evaluate students to avoid examination malpractice. I believe that with these things that the government is doing, we can say Cameroon will not, in the nearest future, let's say the next 3, 4, 5 years, Cameroon will not be too far behind. I think we'll leave the Group D and enter maybe in Group B, why not Group A, which is something very, very important. And all these things are being done with one aim. The golden objective is to prepare Cameroonian students, Cameroonian citizens to the global competition, because the world is becoming a global village. Absolutely. And if your citizens are not competitive, they'll completely disappear. So we are believing that what is being done so far at the level of the various stakeholders, the major stakeholders, that's the Ministry of Higher Education, Ministry of Secondary Education, Ministry of Basic Education, they are all doing what they are doing with the aim of preparing Cameroonian citizens to be globally competitive, which is the essence of education in the 21st century. We cannot be competitive if we cannot have access to lessons online. We cannot be competitive if we cannot be exposed to enterprises for internship. We cannot be competitive if our evaluation system is still traditional. So all those things that have been put in place, even though not yet at 100%, we hope in the nearest future things will far better.
Exactly.
So thank you.
Exactly. And now to you, Dr. FONGOD, immensely, you listen to your co-panelists and his point of view with regards to how stakeholders can immerse themselves to be able to impact this change at the level of the educational sector. But now, as a Pan-Africanist and from a different point of view, how would collaboration at the level of Africa and at the global scene, how would it impact this change through education?
That's we have so many sectors, okay, on the African continent that whose are all driven, by the basis of education. It doesn't matter whether you're in the mining sector, you're in the, finance sector, tech sector, agricultural sector. It doesn't matter which landscape that you belong to. The reality is that you can only go as far as how educated you are in that particular field. And I think that the whole entire notion of you being educated, that does not mirror image, the economic premise to which it is that, or the society in which you're living in, is quite crazy to say the least. So any kind of education that we have must be able to go as far as, the economic state in which you find the country, so that we can now be able to educate young people, to fill up jobs that we absolutely need to have, so that we can push our civilization, push our communities forward. It's quite interesting that by the time you start talking about education, I think I'm reminded by Plato in his book, The Republic. If you've read Plato, The Republic, that is a text I absolutely hold in high regard. He talks about this allegory about the cave, where he says if you had people who are trapped in the cave, obviously they'll be prisoners. And while they're in the cave, the only image they see is that there's a light source behind them while they're in the cave. And there are some kind of images placed before the light source, so that they see the reflection of those images on the wall before them, looking more like a projector. So it's actually, you have images of cattle, images of God knows anything, and it's projected on the wall. That perspective, because they've been trapped in that cave all of their lives, will be the images that they see. But he says that if suddenly you got that individual out of the cave, and then you brought the person out into the light, into the open daylight, for a second, they're dazed. They don't really know where they are. They don't know what's going on, but they're in this whole totally new environment. And then suddenly what they saw as caricatures, as just, fuzzy images on this wall in the cave, they start seeing the reality, that perspective change. He states that the ability for them to leap out of that dark cave into the light is the word education, which is educado in the Latin. All right, so it's the word leaping out of. The reality is that for us on the African continent, we must be able to leap out of darkness, and this darkness is the darkness that has been placed on us by our colonial era. You have gone through, almost 100 generations where young people have not been able to have the right form of education as our ancestors actually had. Remember, the education we had before was the kind of education that built great civilizations, like that of Benin, great civilizations, like that of Kemet. These great civilizations were built as a result of the form of education that we had. But the moment, the enslavers showed up and Europeans came along, they gave us a form of education that literally made us to become subservient to who they are. And obviously, we have not been able to build a robust society, in our own continent. If we look at how gifted the African is in relationship to his knowledge in science, knowledge in technology, you will realize that if all of that brain power that is scattered, across the world in some tech giant somewhere, if all of that brain power was brought back into the continent will be a supercontinent. Some of the brightest people running some of the most profitable companies out there in the world are Africans. So we need to be able to make sure that what we are teaching on the African continent is no longer the history of the white man. It's no longer the history of the enslavers. It is actually our history, number one, and then we must be able to now emerge ourselves in technology to become competent and competitive in the future. I don't think that we can absolutely be able to do anything else outside of that. We must make sure that we start having people in the continent that are trained, are smart enough to be able to handle our educational system. There's this whole entire thing about equality. I am not a big fan of equality, especially when it's equality of outcome, not equality of competence. If you're going to talk about equality, let it be equality of competence, not equality of outcome. And the reason for that is because I don't want to have somebody who is there just because, we are trying to basically have some kind of an integration where somebody from some part of the continent or some part of the country is in power, not because they are competent for the job. We need to be able to have the right people setting up the right decisions, because what we have for us to be able to compete in the 21st century, it has nothing to do with where you're coming from. It has nothing to do with where you were born. It has nothing to do with how less privileged you were. I now want to give you some recognition. It has everything to do with if you have what it takes to be able to compete in the 21st century. Tell me exactly what your skills, your abilities are in the marketplace. How valuable are you in the marketplace? That's what you're looking for. The market can become extremely quite brutal. The market is not interested in how you look like or what the color of your skin is. The market is interested in value. And if you have something that is more valuable than another, everyone will pay for what is more valuable, and everyone is looking for value. That's why the market does exist. So we need to be able to have individuals that will be looking out for the value that they can create in the life of our young ones, not just, setting up a system where it's quite shocked that in a place like Cameroon, we are still talking about, the Ministry of Education having some kind of a YouTube platform where people can go over there and watch some educational materials. The YouTube has existed for more than 20 years, and the reality is that people for more than 20 years in the Western world have been having access to YouTube. Either you're uploading educational materials or they're basically just educating themselves because it's literally free. It's a platform for everybody. And so it's quite shameful that it is now that we're talking about that 20 years later. We need to be able to do better. And I think that, I will employ the private sector to be able to actually come in and fill in where the government is failing. If the private sector can absolutely do what the private sector does best, by creating jobs, creating opportunities, having, giving access and equity to young people, especially those in zones that they don't have access to internet access, to be able to do so. There's some young entrepreneur who can absolutely set up these centers, in remote villages. All these guys who are out there talking about, the setting up NGOs. This is a very good platform to be able to do so. It's not just about saying you're feeding the homeless or you're feeding the needy, feeding the poor. Forget that stuff. Let's be able to educate young people who will grow up, set up businesses that will be able to employ thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, why not millions of people? And then we don't have to talk about the issues of poverty. We don't have to talk about the issues of homelessness. We don't have to talk about, the issues where young children in orphanages cannot be taken care of, because we have the resources, the ability, the capacity to be able to do so. Those who basically become good, in these fields will become those who raise up funding for the infrastructural development that we need across the continent.
Not a whole lot of information to process in a bid for Africa to be able to take all this into consideration when talking about education for change in the African continent. But then, Dr. Nick, in your perspective, do you share the same opinion as your co-panelists?
So again, what should Africa be correcting in her educational system? Number one, we should get 80% of our youths to study science, technology, engineering, economics, and mathematics in our schools. The school systems like the one in Cameroon, where we have some children in one secondary school called technical school and another called grammar schools, that is all bullshit. You bring all of these schools together, all the youths, and throw them into a composite kind of school, a comprehensive college, where they learn everything. Expose the children to everything so that they can discover their talents. Make sure that all schools have laboratories. Make sure that all schools have properly trained teachers so that they can introduce children to this science, technology, and engineering and mathematics in a way that is attractive, and they don't have to memorize things. They don't have to see it as difficult. Make the study of science, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology fun. But the way we teach them here as if we were lecturing history or geography, and it makes it very, very difficult for children to follow, and therefore they fall on the way, because the way the teachers delivered was not the best. And so we have to look into our delivery systems and try to correct that. We have a problem with delivery. We have no laboratories, and that's what makes a bad situation worse. So we will first have to, restructure our schools and probably lay off about 50% of the teachers and professors because they're not doing the right thing. Send them into the rice fields and teach them to do rice cultivation with equipment, and then take the rest who are good, and then give them the practical skills so they can teach our children the right things. There are many youths out there who have left universities and have first and second degrees in the sciences. Give them teaching skills. Make sure they hone their skills in practical work, and then put them in the school system. One thing though that I want to call our attention to is this thing of ranking in schools, where the child is first, second, third, and fourth, and so on. No, that thing is bad. It's actually killing our youths. It's no use. Don't rank children again in schools. It's a bad thing. Let the child compete against his or herself. That ranking actually discourages children. And don't forget that there are many kinds of intelligences. And so when we send our children to the kind of schools we have now, we are only testing the logical, mathematical intelligence. And then we are testing the abilities of a fish and a monkey in tree climbing and swimming, which is all wrong. So we are actually doing the wrong thing and labeling some children as dull when they are not. It's just that we didn't tap into their own area of giftings.
Exactly, Dr. Nick. And now, I believe you, Mr. NCHENDEH Christian, will believe or as aligned with Dr. Nick with regards to that, given that earlier on mentioned the aspect of agriculture at the education sector. But then, in a bit to proceed, we've been looking at the level of government sectors, Dr. FONGOD. We believe that at the level of policy making, those or lawmakers can be able to impact in some way the way education would turn out on the African continent, especially one that they are experiencing and the one it's a turn to change. Now, given the African continent is moving towards sustainable development, at the level of policy making, how can this issue of education for change be addressed?
When it comes to policies, I think that we need to be able to I probably will piggyback a little bit with the last speaker. I think that we have to be able to find ways in which, in other words, let me say this. If I was going to be given the opportunity to revamp the educational system in Cameroon, the truth of the matter is that no teacher will be left standing. And the reason for that is because the people who educated them knew no better. So you have a system where those educating those to teach are uneducated in the subject that they're educating those to teach the subjects are. What that means is this, that we have teachers who are teaching others on things that they absolutely know little or nothing about. If you show up in the Western world, especially out here in the West, you'll realize that those who are teaching, especially in the economic field, in the science field, they're actually working in the private sector. That simply means even though they're teachers, they're in some laboratory somewhere. Even though they're teachers, they're basically at the stock market, the stock exchange trading. Even though they're teachers, they're CFO, CEO of some major company. So by the time they're teaching you, they are not just informing you, they're impacting you with real life simulations as to what is happening. They're talking to you about what happened, when the London Stock Exchange closed, when the New York Stock Exchange closed. They're looking in real time with all the indexes to make, and so by the time they're telling you, teaching you, you're having a real world perspective as to what is happening. And so in somewhat, you're getting some real hands-on training as opposed to some guy who just sit in some classroom and give you theory upon theory upon theory. That means absolutely nothing. So I think that we need to be able to have teachers that are entrenched in what is it that they're teaching. They are absolutely doing it. So if I had a teacher who is going to teach me on fish farming, and the teacher basically does not even own a fish farm or is not working for a company that owns a fish farm, then that person have absolutely no right to be talking to me. So I think if we're going to talk about framework and policy on the African continent, we need to start by making sure that those who are educating our young ones have the skill and the skill sets to be able to do so. Not just the theoretical aspect of things, because as we know, that has not really worked. We need to be able to get into the practical aspects of stuff. So don't talk to me about programming just from a theoretical perspective. I need to be able to know about programming. And if you're going to teach me anything, why not use a program that we are currently using right now in the world, especially when we have come of age where we have the Internet of all things, okay, with the advancement of AI, blockchain technology. So why don't we start using programs that are being used in these fields? If we're going to teach anything, why not those programs? 20 years ago, when I was trying to find my way in the tech environment, the classes I was taking in school were actually the classes that were being used in the field. Okay, programming language like C++. Those, and they're still using that programming language till date. All right, so by the time I was studying networking, we're using textbooks by Cisco. We are still, those Cisco routers and Cisco switches are still in use today. So the idea that we have to be able to just stick on theory without having any practical stuff, it's something else that we shouldn't do. Just so I can say this before I let it go. I remember perfectly we're doing a programming language at the a polytechnic in Bamenda many years ago, and it was called Fortran 77. So we did the whole entire programming language and every single thing else. When I eventually showed up in the US, I was in class when I was asked if I've ever taken any programming language before. I said yes, and they said, which one? I said Fortran 77. The teacher was extremely quite impressed. He's like, wow. So he's like, here's a computer, go ahead, do your thing. I looked at the computer, I was like, no, I've never seen a computer before. I've never worked on this stuff before. The only thing I know how is to write the program. So he said, write the program. I wrote the program on the board on a single doorbell. And by the time he ran the whole thing on the computer, it works. But the truth is, he was quite fascinated that I knew nothing about writing the program on the computer and running it, because I've never done that before. But I was able to give him out a written out program on the blackboard, which eventually, turned out to be correct. So my idea is this: if you're going to be able to set up any kind of an educational system, it must be hands-on. We must be able to get folks in a place where we train people not to go out and look for jobs, but we train people to go out and create jobs. Train young entrepreneurs to become job creators, not job seekers.
Exactly. Now, given what you've said, now back to you, NCHENDEH Christian. In your opinion, we mentioned at our preamble at the beginning of this program that the Egyptian Minister of Education had cited, in line with what you mentioned earlier on, that it was imperative for the African continent to revamp its education system. You earlier on talked about the issue of the curricula on the African continent, which was in line with what this Minister of Education said, that Africa needs to review their curricula. Now, as a pedagogic expert, do you share the same opinion, and do you believe that would work in Africa? Mr. NCHENDEH Christian, are you with us? If Christian, okay, please, can you unmute your mic? Christian,
yes,
please, if you are with us and you can hear us 5 on 5, please, can you unmute your mic so we can proceed?
Yes, it's on mute.
Okay. So I was asking earlier on, you had my question. Please, can you continue with your response?
Okay, first of all, we are talking about education for change. And when there's change, we need to acknowledge, because the more we acknowledge, the more we motivate those who are in power to do a better thing. Just unlike Dr. Stanley, who was like baffled that 20 years ago, YouTube have been existing and the foreigners, the Westerners have been uploading videos, and just of recent, Cameroon is trying to do what others have been doing for long. We need to appreciate when change comes, and at times it comes in little bits. So the small that has come, we need to appreciate and really talk about it, because there are many people here in Cameroon who don't even know the existence of the YouTube channel of the ministry. I think maybe one of the things after this program, after this talking point, would be to plead if the various media houses, the journalists that are involved, would help sensitize people about this available learning possibility, which means many students now on holidays, they can be at home and they go and have access to lessons that are existing already in the platform. Because I've just gone through and scored at maximum. There are some lessons with less than 5 views. Can you imagine that a lesson published almost 3 months ago is not having up to 5 views? So it means many people are not aware of it. I think one of the things at the end of this, our talking point could be the media houses trying to sensitize the population about the existence of a platform, of a learning platform like the YouTube channel of the Ministry of Secondary Education. Okay, coming to their question, I align 100% with what Dr. Nick has said about the changes that we will need in our educational system, the STEM, the labs, and the transformation generally. Secondly, I'm going to equally align with what Dr. Stanley has said, and I'll bring now some new things that I think can help to improve these changes that we are talking about in Africa as a whole. One of the major things is inclusivity. How inclusive is our educational system? You will still go to some secondary schools, some primary schools, and you discover that those who are living with disability, they may not have access to even enter some classrooms, especially classrooms that are upstairs. So the educational reforms should also look at the inclusive nature of it. When they're building infrastructure, they should consider those who may have disability. That's for physical disability. Some people may have disability like blindness, which quite there are a lot of, we are still backward at that level. People who cannot see, they have a lot of difficulties, even at a level of evaluation, even though the GC board is doing a lot to improve on that. Equally, access to education is still a little bit very slow in our context. You will see some villages may not have adequate structures, not to talk about associated infrastructure like electricity and internet. I'm just talking about the normal building itself, the creation of schools without appropriate structures, the creation of schools without appropriate lab in terms of equipment, creation of schools without appropriate maybe appointment or transfer of an adequate number of teachers to those schools. It's really not an easy thing, and we appreciate the efforts that have been going on with the collaboration between the Ministry of Secondary Education, that's the government of Cameroon, and UNICEF, and UNESCO, to try to make sure that those areas that are highly enclave can have access to basic education. But at level of secondary, it's not yet that feasible. Some areas don't have at all, which is a call for concern, because no matter what we're doing, we are not limiting education for change only in the big cities. The real people who are really in need, in fact, are those who are in the remote areas, those who are in Furawa, those who are in Akwaya, those who are in Bakassi Peninsula, those who are in those areas where this is highly enclave. So we should not be limiting this change only in the urban cities. Let's also look at it in a holistic approach, rural areas and urban areas, because when there's a gap between the level of development of infrastructure, it calls for inequity. So our hope is that one day a child is schooling in a faraway area like Mora should be able to have the same quality of education like the child is schooling in Akwa, in Douala.
Exactly. And those are some of the moves or measures that the government, not just of Cameroon, but of different countries across Africa and the world at large, should take into consideration when ensuring that there's equity at the level of how education is being sent across to the young population. Now, in a bit, to get your point of view, Dr. Nick, we've been reiterating on this platform that education on the African continent, especially its systems, do need a revamp, and that is in line with your co-panelist, Mr. NCHENDEH Christian. And now, what measures should be taken into consideration amidst this change, in this changing times, of course, when revamping the education system in Africa?
I have asked the question as to what can we do so that we can create 2 million jobs for youths in Cameroon every 2 years. If we can sincerely sit down and look at this question and look at the problem and try to solve it, we will realize that by the time we can give 2 million jobs to Cameroonian youths every 2 years, we would have solved the problem of education, because it is impossible to create those jobs if you don't translate the education to be able to solve the problem that we have on hand. So let us reframe our approach and everything that we say or do by stating a problem and say, how can we provide 2 million jobs to youths in Cameroon every 2 years? What must we do to our educational system to give the youth the capacity to create those jobs? Then we'll go and look at what we call jobs. By jobs, we don't mean going and sitting in offices and having air-conditioned rooms and flipping papers all day long and telling long stories. By jobs, we mean how do we train our youth to be able to be productive, to produce the goods and services, to produce the goods that will replace 95% of the important goods we have on our shelves. If you go and look at our shelves now, our supermarket shelves, 95% of the goods are imported. How do we train our youth so that those 95% of the goods that we import are made by our youth? How do we train our youth so that they can build our own televisions, build our own Samsung phones, build our solar systems, give us green energies, take away the dirt from our streets? Haven't you ever asked yourself the question, how comes we have universities and we're training people with masters in what? Masters and PhD in public health. We are training people with masters and PhD in bacteriology and microbiology, and our streets are so dirty and there's dirt all over the whole place, and we keep churning out all these certificates. So there is a problem. We need to train people in a way that they solve our problems. There's no point training a lot of people to have PhDs and master's degree in microbiology, in public health, when our streets and our markets are so filthy, when our cities have no public toilets, when we have no water, when our homes are so dilapidated, and so on. So there is a disconnect between our education and our problems. We are not paying attention to that, and that's where we need to go. Thanks.
Exactly, that is where we need to go. Now to you, Dr. FONGOD, to listen to your co-panelists. But being a Pan-Africanist, now when we talk of education now for political change, as a Pan-Africanist, how can we modify, or better still revamp education so it gets to suit the present times, or say present changes which the world is facing at the moment, and bring about change in, say, political mindsets and a host of others, like cited to your co-panelists?
To Mr. Christian, that I really do applaud, especially in the case of Cameroon, what they're doing, which is still comical. And so it's not that I absolutely think that you're not doing what they're supposed to do. All I'm saying is that they have done nothing. And frankly speaking, I double down on that. There's nothing to celebrate. I was in Cameroon within the pandemic, and I was locked up in Cameroon like everybody else who had come into the country around that time. And one of the things I witnessed on television was that the Minister of Health had gone to some village and gave the people face mask. And the villagers rolled out the drums and they were dancing and celebrating, thanking God because the Minister of Health has shown up in that community with a face mask. And the next question I asked was, what was the minister supposed to do? Was the minister supposed to cook rice, cook fufu and arrow or some stuff like that? What is the job of the minister? If we are celebrating that the minister showed up with face masks, what I'm trying to ask is this: what about the hospital? What about the research hospitals? What about, the health centers? What about the clinics that we're supposed to have? Who is subsidizing our medications? Who is making sure that the type of medications that is in the market, it's not some counterfeit that is aberrant to someone's health? Who is making sure that what we're putting in our body in relationship to medicine has been controlled by somebody who has the capacity to do so? Who is making sure that is what is being imported into the country in the name of medication, it's the right medication, not some counterfeit from China or India? And obviously, I think that once we have lost our sense of celebration, once we have lost our sense of what to celebrate, then the moral clarity as to what is it that we need or what is it that where we are going to, becomes a little bit quite fuzzy. I am not saying I'm ungrateful. I'm not sitting here saying that I know better than anybody else. All I'm saying is this, that we cannot sit here, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years later, and still be complaining about the same things we complained about 30, 40 years ago. So if there are any changes I'm seeing right now, it's just because I'm frustrated about the fact that this thing has lingered for so long that 4 or 5 decades we are still talking about the same thing. Then there's nothing to talk about. It is an absolute failure on the part of the government. It's an absolute failure on the part of everyone who is in charge. So we need to be able to make sure that we hold people accountable, especially when it comes to the things they need to be held accountable with. Our educational system is at the forefront of everything else that we need to do so far as our civilization on the African continent is concerned. I love the fact that we are approaching the STEM studies. I love the fact that we are absolutely incorporating that into our educational system because that's the way to go. All I'm saying is we need to be able to have a robust framework, educational framework on the African continent that literally mandates that if you're going to be if you're going to graduate out of our high schools on the African continent, you must be able to graduate out of our high schools with a skill set. I think one of our contributors said something which is quite fascinating. My father actually taught in the technical education. I did the general education and then eventually switched into a polytech because my mind was not into anything general education stuff. I wanted to be able to be hands-on. As a child, I loved building Yagi areas, the antenna that I used to have on the outside of the house. Those posts, most young people will not even know what that is. They used to call them Yagi areas. I was manufacturing my own when I was 10. I was in a church with a guy who was building welding machines, building charging machines, building motors, repairing alternators. So I spent most of my time, in my secondary school years working with him. So I was very hands-on with those things. For me, the idea to sit somewhere in some class and get theory that was not practical did not make any sense. So, but we thought that those in the technical education were quite dull, not knowing that that's actually a whole lot more serious than whatever garbage we are getting so far as our education, so far as general education was concerned. So we need to be able to have a hybrid system, and a hybrid system will mean that we need to teach people with the framework of a technical education, but with the basis of general education, so that any young man who is graduating or young woman who is graduating out of a high school should be able to have some skill set, something that they can actually be able to use to support themselves just in case they do not have the ability to go to further their education into the university. There are a lot of things that can be taught, a lot of things that can be done, from carpentry, which is basically woodwork, to those who basically just kind of bricklaying, civil engineers. I mean, there's a lot of areas that can be covered, and you will have young people graduating from our high schools that have the skill sets to be able to survive anywhere on the continent. My take is this: if we do not revamp our educational systems to be able to be a hybrid system where we have the general education with the technical education, marrying at some point and allowing young people to have both perspective as they get out into the job market or as they exit our schools, then our educational system is still flawed. And if we do not change this just at the high school level, then we have a long, long, long way to go to catch up with the rest of the world.
Exactly. And of course, like mentioned earlier on, the world is in a digital age and of course it's evolving over time. Now to conclude with you, Mr. NCHENDEH Christian, and now you listen to your co-panelists in a bit to close up today's conversation. In your opinion, as a pedagogic expert, what is the way forward?
Well, the way forward to our educational system as a whole and for a change in education is for more of practicalities. That's a system of education where practicals occupies 80% of the learning process. Exposure to reality, because practical means exposure to reality, where we move from theories to reality to practicals. So that's the first thing. If we can succeed to arrive at that level, it will be very important. But it's a process, and gradually we'll one day get there. The second thing I will recommend for a change is communication, because they are doing a lot, but they don't communicate. So many people don't know the new things that are coming up. For instance, there are some new programs that the government is actually working on. Let me give you an example, even though the programs are not yet out officially, but maybe the next 3 to 4 years or 2 years, why not this year, we may have them in our subsystem of education. We may be having students who will be doing GC O level in banking and insurance. That's a new thing. That is, the program is almost 95% crafted already. The students now in the technical education, they can do banking and insurance at the level of at the O levels. Then at the second cycle, there are new programs coming in like digital process, professional reporting, transport and logistics management. This is something that was done only at the university, but now with the new programs, the students will be capable of doing transport and logistics management at the level of A levels. Hotel management too is coming up. Tourism management is equally another program coming up. And finally, bakery and pastry management. So those are things that the Ministry of Secondary Education is having sleepless nights, making sure that the trainings that are doing, the output from secondary should be adapted to the job market. Should be like ready-made product that the students should be living and ready to occupy positions in our society. So we cannot stay without saying and highlighting these new things that are coming up, these innovations that the Minister, Professor Nalova, is bringing at the level of the secondary. Is her own touch with the concept of clean school, which we need to really appreciate, and to thank her for those innovations that she's bringing, which are adapting to the talk of the day, education for change. Because there's no need to train students where they cannot even photocopy a document. Train students, you see a student with A level, 5 A's, but you give a small paper that photocopy in an office, the student cannot photocopy. So the educational system that the Minister of Secondary is trying to bring now is more of practicals, where the students are going to be taught on things that are evolving around their environment. It's no more going to be too abstract. So I think that's the way forward.
Thank you immensely, Mr. NCHENDEH Christian. You are an educationist, like we mentioned, and we equally acknowledge the presence or the contribution of Dr. FONGOD for taking the time to be part of today's edition. We equally say thank you to you, Dr. NJIX, who was a part of this edition as well. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be cutting down or drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point over your #1 Pan-African channel. Thank you for watching. Meanwhile, we wish you a great day in company of our programs.